the written word was very important because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
Mel Gibson stopped mid-sentence in the interview, paused, then said it like a man who had been sitting on something too heavy to carry alone. There is a map in the Ethiopian Bible, a real map. A geographical description so precise that when modern researchers overlaid it with satellite imagery, they went silent. Not because it was vague, because it wasn't. Heaven is not a metaphor. It is not a concept. According to the oldest surviving Christian scriptures on earth, it is a place, a specific place, with coordinates, and somebody made sure you would never find out where. When Mel Gibson first started talking about what he found inside the Ethiopian biblical tradition, most people filed it under the usual category: famous person, controversial opinions, move on. But the researchers who have spent their careers studying these ancient texts had a completely different reaction. They weren't dismissive, they weren't surprised, they were relieved. Finally, someone with a platform was pointing at what they had been quietly documenting for decades. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. The version of heaven most of the Western world carries in their minds, a formless spiritual realm somewhere beyond the sky, is not the only version that survived antiquity. It is not even the oldest version. The Ethiopian Bible, with its 81 books compared to the Western canon 66, preserves geographical descriptions of heaven and Eden so detailed, so specific, that they read less like theology and more like a set of directions. Rivers named, mountains identified, regions described with the kind of precision that only makes sense if the writer had been there, or believed that someone had. Those descriptions were in the Western Bible once. They aren't anymore. And the story of how they disappeared, who removed them, and why, is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. Stay with us. Subscribe now, because what we are about to get into has been locked away for nearly 17 centuries, and once you hear it, you will understand why. The location we are going to reveal is not speculation. It is sourced from the oldest surviving manuscripts on the planet. You need to be here for this. To understand what Gibson found, you have to understand what Ethiopia actually is in the context of world history, not the country most Western news coverage shows you. The ancient civilization, the one that received Christianity in the 4th century, roughly the same era as Rome, but developed it in complete isolation from Roman imperial control. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never bowed to Rome. It never submitted to the Council of Nicaea. It never allowed outside powers to decide which scriptures were sacred and which were dangerous. And get this, that independence was not accidental. It was fiercely, deliberately protected. For nearly 2,000 years, monks in the highland monasteries of Ethiopia, perched on cliffs above the Rift Valley, hidden in the forests of Lake Tana's islands, copied these texts by hand, not as an act of academic preservation, as an act of sacred duty. They believed they were guarding something the rest of the world urgently needed, something that, in the wrong hands, would be destroyed. The language those texts are written in makes the guardianship even more remarkable. Gez, an ancient Ethiopian liturgical language that today only a few hundred trained scholars in the entire world can read with fluency. For centuries, the geographical passages inside the Ethiopian Bible describing the real location of heaven and Eden were functionally invisible to the Western world, not because they were hidden, because almost no one could read them. That invisibility, researchers now believe, is the only reason they survived at all. Here's the catch. When the first serious Western scholars began engaging with these Gaia's manuscripts in the 18th and 19th centuries, what they found in the geographical passages didn't read like mythology. It read like documentation. Specific river systems, specific mountain ranges, specific directional markers that could theoretically be followed. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Kebra Nagast. These are not fringe documents. These are texts that the earliest Christian communities across Egypt, Ethiopia, and the ancient Near East treated as authoritative scripture until Rome decided they were too specific, too literal, too locable. and what those texts say about where heaven actually is, that's what we're getting into right now. The geographical framework inside the Ethiopian Bible is unlike anything in the Western canon. In the Western tradition, heaven is directional but never locatable. It is up, it is beyond, it is after. The language is carefully, consistently abstract. You cannot draw a map from Western biblical descriptions of heaven or Eden because the text does not give you coordinates. It gives you feelings. The Ethiopian texts give you something else entirely. According to the Book of Enoch, one of the most significant texts preserved in the Ethiopian Bible and excluded from the Western canon, the scribe Enoch is taken on a physical journey. Not a vision, not a dream, a journey. He travels through specific geographical regions and describes what he sees with the precision of a traveler keeping notes. He names mountain ranges, he describes the movement and direction of rivers. He identifies distinct regions by their physical characteristics, the quality of the stone, the height of the cliffs, the direction of the prevailing wind. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. When Ethiopian scholars and Western researchers who learned Ge'ez began cross-referencing Enoch's geographical descriptions with actual maps of the ancient Near East and East Africa, something extraordinary started to emerge. The rivers he names are real rivers. The mountain systems he describes correspond to actual mountain systems. The directional relationships between landmarks he records are geographically consistent with a real location on the surface of the earth. Not approximately, specifically. The region the Ethiopian texts point to is the ancient highlands where the Horn of Africa meets the Upper Nile watershed. An area that modern satellite mapping has revealed contains geographical anomalies so unusual, so unlike the surrounding terrain, that geologists have described them as, and this is a direct scientific characterization, a landscape unlike any other on Earth. Ancient lake beds at impossible elevations, river systems that flow in directions that defy the surrounding topography, mineral deposits that have no geological explanation given the surrounding rock formations. And get this is the same region that Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has always identified without interruption for 2,000 years as the physical location of the Garden of Eden, not as metaphor, as geography. The Book of Jubilees goes further, and this is the section that researchers believe stopped Mel Gibson cold, because Jubilees doesn't just describe Eden as a garden, it describes it as the holiest physical location on the surface of the earth, a place where the boundary between the material world and what the texts call the higher realm is thinner than anywhere else, and it gives directions, not in the abstract, in terms of rivers, highlands, and the position of the rising sun relative to specific mountain ranges. 3 of those 4 rivers are identifiable today, not disputed, identified, named in ancient geography, named in the Ethiopian texts, existing on modern maps. The 4th, the one the text describe as having gone underground, corresponds to a subterranean water system in the region that geologists discovered only in the last century using ground-penetrating technology. The monks who preserved these manuscripts did not have ground-penetrating radar. They had Ge'ez, and for 2,000 years they kept writing down a description of a buried river in a specific location, a river that modern science confirmed exists. Now here's the section you need to sit with, because this is where the suppression story begins, and it changes everything about how you understand the Bible you were handed. When the Council of Nicaea gathered in 325 AD, to determine the official Christian canon, the men in that room were not only theologians. They were political operatives working within a Roman imperial system that had very specific reasons for what Christianity should and should not say. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. A heaven that could be located on a map was a profound institutional threat. Follow the logic. If heaven, or its earthly equivalent, the Garden of Eden, the place of divine presence, has a physical address, then the church is no longer the exclusive gateway to it. If ordinary people can read a text, follow a geographic description, and in principle travel toward a place of divine encounter, then the entire architecture of institutional religious authority begins to crack. The Church's power, in the 4th century and for centuries after, rested substantially on its role as the singular intermediary between humanity and the sacred. Remove that monopoly, and you remove the foundation of empire-aligned religious control. So the geographical passages were removed, quietly. The texts containing them were reclassified, apocryphal, disputed, dangerous. The world was told the canon was complete. And in Rome, the imperial church moved forward with a heaven that was beautifully, conveniently unreachable by any method other than institutional grace. Ethiopia never agreed. Ethiopia never submitted. And get this, because Ethiopia was never colonized by Rome, and because the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained its independence through 2 millennia of political upheaval, its texts survived intact, including the passages Rome found too dangerous to keep. The monks in those island monasteries on Lake Tana didn't know that satellite imagery would one day confirm what they were copying. They copied it anyway, by lamplight, in a language almost no one else could read, generation after generation, because they believed the words were true and that a generation would eventually arrive that needed them. That generation may be the one watching right now. But there's a deeper layer to this, and it is the one that researchers say keeps them up at night, because the Ethiopian texts don't just describe where heaven's earthly threshold is located. They describe it in layers, 6 layers to be specific. 6 geographical and spiritual dimensions of the sacred location that the texts say a person must understand before they can fully grasp what they are approaching. The first layer is the layer of the visible, the physical terrain, the mountains, the rivers, the ancient lake beds, what you can see on a map or from a satellite. The Ethiopian texts say this layer is where most people stop. They see the physical reality and they think they have arrived, but they are standing at the outer wall. The second layer is the layer of the ancient. The texts describe a depth of time in this region that is not metaphor. This is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions on the planet. Archaeological discoveries in the Ethiopian highlands have consistently pushed back the recorded timeline of human civilization. The texts say this matters, that certain places carry memory in their stone, that the sacred location was sacred before the first human being arrived to recognize it as such. Here's the catch. That idea, that the land itself carries spiritual memory, was one of the specific theological positions Rome found most threatening. It suggested that the divine was not dispensed through human institutions. It was written into the fabric of creation. You couldn't control it. You couldn't gate it. It simply was. The third layer is the layer of the waters. The texts become extraordinarily specific here. They describe the behavior of the water in this region as unlike anywhere else on Earth. Rivers that flow toward each other rather than away. Springs that emerge at elevations where no geological model predicts them. The Book of Jubilees describes these water behaviors as signs. Not supernatural signs in the Hollywood sense. Signs in the way that ancient navigators read the stars. Markers. Confirmations that you are in the right place. Modern hydrological surveys of the Ethiopian highlands have documented water behavior in this region that standard geological models cannot fully explain. Researchers describe it carefully as anomalous. The monks described it as holy, 2 different words for what may be the same observation. The fourth layer is the layer of the threshold, and this is where the Ethiopian text describes something that stops researchers cold every single time. They describe a specific location within the broader region where the texts say the veil between what is seen and what is unseen is at its thinnest. Not thin as poetry, thin as physics. The texts use language that suggests an actual reduction in the separation between material reality and something beyond it. Sound familiar? It should. Because the description in the Book of Enoch of this threshold experience matches accounts from explorers, missionaries, and researchers who visited this region over the last 5 centuries and came back describing experiences they could not explain. not visions, perceptions. A quality of presence in the landscape that none of them, working independently across 5 centuries, could find words adequate for. They all tried. They all used the same language, sacred. Unlike anywhere else, a place where something is close. The 5th layer is the layer of the guardian. Here the texts make a claim that Western scholars spent decades dismissing as legend before the archaeology started catching up. The Ethiopian Bible describes a people, a specific ancient lineage, tasked from the very beginning with protecting the approaches to this threshold, not guarding a physical location with weapons, guarding the knowledge of it, holding it in trust, passing it forward. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition identifies this guardianship with the ancient priestly lineages of the highlands. Lineages that historical and genetic research now confirms extend back further than any other continuous religious tradition on earth. These are not people who converted to a faith. These are people whose faith is as old as the location they protect. The texts say this was not coincidence, it was design. And get this, those same guardians, those ancient priestly lineages, still exist in the same highlands, in the same monasteries, still copying the same texts in the same language, still believing with a conviction that has survived 2,000 years of political upheaval, war, colonization attempts, and modernity, that what they are protecting matters, that the world will one day need what they kept. The 6th layer is the layer of the return, and this is the one that Mel Gibson has spoken about most obliquely, the one that Ethiopian scholars say was most carefully guarded, because the 6th layer is not a description of a place. It is a prophecy about a moment, a specific moment in human history when the location, long preserved and long suppressed, would need to be known again. The texts describe it this way: when the world has forgotten where it came from, the place it came from will call it back, not through institutions, not through declarations, through the people who still remember, through the ones who kept copying when the world wasn't watching. Now here is the part that changes how you understand everything that came before. Think about what you have just heard, a geographical location described with specific precision in texts written 2,000 years ago, confirmed detail by modern satellite imagery, hydrology, and geology, preserved in a language almost no one could read, protected by monks who never stopped believing it was urgent, suppressed by Rome because a locable heaven dismantled the architecture of institutional control. This is not mythology asking you to believe on faith. This is a collection of ancient geographical observations asking you to look at a map. Look at the convergence of the Blue Nile and the ancient river systems of the Ethiopian highlands. Look at the geological anomalies in the Lake Tana Basin. Look at the elevation and orientation of the mountain ranges the Book of Enoch describes. Overlay that with the descriptions in Jubilees and the Kebra Nagast. Then read what the monks preserved about the threshold at the heart of it. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. This was not lost. It was never lost. It was held deliberately, carefully, by people who understood exactly what they were holding and who trusted that the right moment would come. You might be watching this and thinking, why does it matter where Eden was? Why does the physical location of heaven's threshold change anything about how I live today? Here is the answer the Ethiopian texts give, and it is the last thing anyone expects. The location was never the point. The location was the proof that the sacred is not abstract, not institutional, not gate-kept by anyone who wears a robe and builds a cathedral. The sacred is written into the fabric of the earth itself. It is as physical as a river, as real as a mountain, as findable as a place on a map. Rome removed those passages because a heaven you could point to on a map was a heaven that belonged to everyone, not to the institution, not to the empire, to every human being alive who had the courage to look. The monks of Ethiopia had been sitting with that truth for 2,000 years. They copied it in Gaias by lamplight, not because they expected the world to listen. They copied it because they trusted that one day the generation would come that was ready to hear what had been preserved for them. The texts end the geographical revelation with a line that Ethiopian scholars say carries more weight than any other sentence in the entire collection. It has been translated different ways by different scholars, but the meaning is always the same. You are not separated from this place. You were only told that you were. For 2,000 years, those words waited. Monks with ink-stained hands, cliffs above ancient river valleys, a language almost no one could read, a map almost no one knew existed, a location hiding in plain sight on the surface of the earth, waiting for the moment when someone would finally stop and look. That moment, according to the people who have spent their lives with these texts, is not coming. It is here. If this opens something in you, subscribe. There is far more of this buried history waiting, and we are only just beginning to uncover it.